Hello and welcome to my Melting Remnant and Awoken Covenant 25 strategy video. A little bit about myself. I've been hitting this combo up pretty hard lately. I've won 17 of the last 35 games I've played with this combo, so around 50% win rate. And I've just come off a six win streak, so I think it's a pretty solid strategy. I feel like Melting Remnant is the clan it seems people usually have the most trouble picking up, and I'm not gonna lie, it does definitely require a bit of finesse to make this work a lot of the time. But once you kind of have a game plan, it really isn't that hard, and I find it pretty good. I wouldn't say they're obviously the best in the game, but from a fun standpoint, I'd say they're my most favorite to play. Like, I've stopped doing random for a while, and I just have been having a lot of fun just with this combo here. And I will say, you know, I've played around with what the best secondary is for Melting Remnant. On the current patch, at least, I'm pretty convinced it's Awoken. But we'll get all into that in a minute here. So let's get into it here. Come on. Okay. So which champ to pick? My general rule is Burnout is always the most consistent, and if not, just go Harvest. And you know, I should also preface this. This is obviously my biases here. This isn't 100% gospel truth. Follow everything here more as guidelines instead of rules necessarily. But I will say, well, let's just go left to right here. So the Burnout version of the Rector Flicker. If you have any sort of Burnout extension, or especially reform in your opening, you know, set of cards that you get, you should pretty much always go Burnout. By the end game, your game plan is not going to be Burnout extension, but what the Burnout extension allows you to do is to take the most consistent version of this champ, which is the Burnout version, and be able to play him in the early game and, you know, try to hunt for either a Molded or a Wicked Blaze. So, you know, if you know, even if you have Sacred Wicks, I would say it's enough to allow you to go the Burnout version. Otherwise, I would lean toward Harvest. Harvest, it can get pretty insane, but don't let, you know, you're going to find a lot of screenshots of this guy just getting huge. Like, yeah, there are runs where that happens, but if we're talking about consistency, he really just does not have the consistency that the Burnout version has. He's much slower to get going, which means usually that's a sacrifice of pyre health that you're looking at. It's much harder to kill tanks with this guy. It's much harder to figure out how to kill bosses in terms, unless you have really insane harvests. To kill bosses, you're going to need a way to either put them on endless or somehow reform him in some meaningful way up to the top. The strategy is, what I will say is, you know, when you have this version of the champ, the Burnout champ, the strategy is so much more consistent, straightforward, and easy to figure out, whereas Harvest requires a lot more finesse and improving to basically make it work. But that being said, I think these have a clear edge over the Resolve version. You know, and like I said, this is my biases, but since it is my video, my strategy here, I'd be lying if I said I ever really find much success with the Resolve version of Rector Flicker. I usually, if I win with him, it's in spite of him, or despite, what's the word I'm looking for? In spite of him rather than because of him. Whereas these guys can just carry you through so many parts of the game. This guy, I just don't think he really provides any value over these two. So the worst situation you're going to find in a starting, you know, thing is you don't get offered any of these type of cards, any Burnout extension, any reform, but you only get offered Burnout Rector and Resolve Rector. That's the worst starting situation you can have with this strategy. You know, I've gone back and forth with what the proper call is there. I think you still take Burnout in that case, and what I would do is just on circle 1, I wouldn't play him in the opener, and I just hope that you can draw back into him to fight the boss and then play him Because I just find this version to be so useless. The stats suck. The resolve really isn't that powerful. Like, random reform is significantly worse than targeted reform, at least in my experience. So, you know, for my money, I would just never pick the resolve version. But, you know, if you find success for them, go for it. You don't need me to tell you not to do it. This is really for people that struggle with the class and want some sort of a game plan. And the game plan I'm providing for you, just don't pick them. Another thing about Harvest, you might be further enticed to take Harvest if you see cards that really synergize well with it. Like Sharpen is pretty good. You can just stick Sharpen on the old Rector Flicker, and he's basically healing himself every time he gets hit, as long as the damage isn't super high. And Remnant Host, any tomb unit really is really good with Rector, the Harvest version, but Remnant Host in particular is like godly good. That's like 3 harvests when you play it, pretty much. But any tomb unit's going to be great there. Glimmer as well is pretty good with them. Any sort of AOE. That being said, though, if I see, you know, if I were to get Sharpen and one of these type of cards, you know, Reform or Burnout Extension, I would definitely still go the Burnout route. The Burnout route is just so much more consistent at all stages of the game and will usually result in a win for you. So next, I just wanted to give a little quick screenshot of like what I would say is like a typical example of this strategy. So some things to note here. I guess I cut off the top of the screenshot, but I would have 2 draw upgrades. You know, if I have the Burnout version of this champ, I'm never taking anything other than the draw upgrades. It's always double draw upgrade. And you'll also notice a lot of spell upgrades here. I typically get as many spell shops as I can in. I can't completely neglect the monster, whatever you call them, Merchant of Steel, but really I want to make everything really cheap because I'm never taking energy as an upgrade. I will say, generally you're always fine to take draw as your boss upgrade, but sometimes you can take space if you went Harvest, because Harvest doesn't really have the luxury all the time to just limit yourself to 2 units. And just to touch on that really quick, you know, with the Burnout champ, really all you want is just 1 DPS unit. This is the most ideal one you can find. You can find her quite often. She's only uncommon, which is the lowest, you know, it's the most common for a banner, most common tier for a banner unit. So it's not like you're not finding Animus of Will quite often, but she's a great example of just an amazing DPS unit. Low health, high damage, a lot of multi-attacks, so easy for her to die, which you do want your DPS unit to die so that you can reform it as much as possible. And then you just stick the Rector in front, and you basically you want them to die as much as possible and reform them as much as possible. And that's really the game plan. You don't want any other units because you want this Animus of Will guaranteed in your opener hand. If you didn't know, the banner units, you're always guaranteed a banner unit in your opener. Now, banner unit, that's going to be the type of unit that you pick when you see like a banner on the map. Like an example of a non-banner unit would be like a tomb unit. They're not going to be guaranteed to be in your opener. Same goes with like a train steward, your drags, even drafts are not banner units. So that's something to keep in mind. You do want a good DPS, ideally banner unit. That way you're guaranteed it in your opener and you can just get going right from the start. And then as far as these cards go, Molded obviously is amazing. This one's Frozen. The ideal situation is actually Holdover, but Frozen is always a good backup plan. I have some Glimmers. Glimmers aren't always needed, but for this particular version of Seraph, which is the Sap Strength Seraph, they have these 15x2 type enemies, and I prioritize AoE a little bit more for this fight. You always want to look ahead to see which Seraph you're facing, because there's slight differences in what you need to do based on each Seraph. But with this particular strategy, that doesn't actually matter that much. Like, I could totally win this fight without these, but They're just kind of good security. And then also razor sharp blade or edge or whatever it's called. Pretty much the best way to buff your units. You can take any form of like damage buffing, but nothing beats this. If you'll see here, like I've already got the damage up to like 114 by 3, so pretty insane damage. And then Crushing Demise, kind of really the most important two components are going to be some reform cards and then ways to kill your units. Crushing Demise is pretty much unbeatable in that regard. So if you see it, you're usually going to want to take it, especially if you already have your reform. Like I would, and you were offered like more reform alongside Crushing Demise, I'd prioritize Crushing Demise. That's how important it is. Like, you know, being able to kill either of your units is amazing, especially if you got these things on holdover, these reforms. And also it's just really good at killing the enemy tanks in particular. Like it would kill a random one here, but you can always, if need be, like if you kill the little units and these tanks get through, you can always just play on the top floor and not worry about killing your own unit. Yeah, and that's pretty much it there. We'll get more specific. So first and foremost, the most important thing you have to look out for is reform. Rarely are you going to find this in your opener, you know, hand or whatever you get, or your deck. But like, don't worry, you're gonna, the chances are you're gonna find it. Every now and then you won't, but there's always options. So like the god tier options here are obviously Wicked Blaze and Molded. I can't really tell you which one I'd prefer. They're both really good. I'd almost say Molded is what I would prefer, simply because I can get it down to 0 energy, and at 0 energy there's just nothing stopping it, you know what I mean? Like Wicked Blaze, it gets down to 1 energy. There's some cases where you might not, like if it's on holdover, you might not be able to play it, like if you're Ember Drained or whatnot, but it's splitting hairs to like really choose between the two. You're gonna probably win the game if you find either of them early enough or late enough. Really just find them at all, you're gonna be good. But we'll get into upgrades later, but holdover is really what you want on these cards. If you can get holdover and then Hellvent one of them, you're already close to winning. Really just the second part of the puzzle, which is the next slide, is what you'd be looking for at that point. But as I said, you're not always going to find Molded and Wicked Blaze. And there's other options. And that's why I kind of noted here, you know, other forms of resurrection. So Remnant Pact, this is not reform, right? But it kind of accomplishes the same problem that we're looking at here, which is essentially the thing that makes this whole strategy so strong is that A, you don't end up caring about the health of your units. So you just don't care about any of the incoming damage because you're just going to keep reforming these guys. And Endless doesn't really change that. That just means it's going to pop right back in your hand next turn. But even more important, the main strength here is like, on top of just being able to then take on the normal mobs, the bosses become almost an auto win, because you can, if you got the solid setup, you can basically fight them with your main 2 units on every single floor, and it's pretty hard to lose against even the final Seraph version if you have that going on. Pretty rare, and Remnant Pack gives you an option there, and I would say Remnant Pack, it is especially good if you get stuck with a Harvest version of Rector, because it's a lot harder to really make that version of Rector reform itself in any meaningful way. It's not impossible. Like if you have a Crushing Demise, you're probably good, but if you don't, which Crushing Demise, that's an uncommon card, you're not always going to find that. Remnant Pack is definitely an okay option. You can just stick that on your Harvest Rector, and you're going to be pretty good, and hopefully you have at least one Molded or something for your DPS unit that you can use them to kind of get both of them up each floor. Now in the same vein, I listed these as desperate. Problem, as I've said, not being able to target your reform is immensely worse than being able to target it. You know, something like this, one thing I will say about the Melting Remnant class is there's kind of two things that really go against this, and they're tomb units and just your normal dregs. In my opinion, dregs are the best of all the starter cards. You know, every clan has like their starter cards. Reason for that is it's the only one that costs 0. All the other ones cost 1. It does technically the most damage of all of them, and it also soaks up the most damage. So, and it also consumes itself. So all in all, the dregs, they're just a really good starter card, and to not be able to play them like is a massive disadvantage. And what I mean there is, like, if you really want to make this game plan work with these cards, you're kind of enticed to not play your dregs, and also to not play your tomb units. And tomb units are amazing, at least in this current patch, other than this one. Yeah, so like Sacred Wicks, like I've made it work before, but it requires a lot. Like it requires you to basically not be able to play any of their units. That way you guarantee that you're reforming your Rector and your DPS unit. And on top of that, you generally also need like an Eternal Stone on it. And even then, you know, you're usually not going to be able to what am I trying to say? To really play it much, because you know, you're probably not getting a holdover on that. I don't think you can get holdover on it, just because the weird mechanic there. And then Formless Child, I'd say it's even worse. Very rarely I can make the dude work, but you know, it requires you to basically do what I said of not playing your dregs, not playing your tomb units, and it can be powerful in those niche situations, but I don't know. It's all at 2 energy. It's a lot of investment to get it to work, and it's also like has a delayed return on your random unit, so it's just not very ideal. But definitely these two are like the highest priority adds that you're looking for. These two reform cards over here, like take them over anything if you see them. It's almost like a snap pick. And then this is the next most important part of the formula, which is being able to kill your own units. Reform really wants to off, you know, if you have these cards on holdover, right? Like if you have Molded, Wicked Blaze, and holdover, that means you're getting it every turn. You really want to lose, you want your unit to die every turn. These 3 are going to be the most consistent ways to do that: Crushing Demise, Subsiding Blade, and Petrified Skull. Now obviously Petrified Skull is a cavern card, so you're not seeing that very often at all, but I thought it was worth mentioning just because my thoughts with this combo, you know, the Melting Remnant and Awoken combo, are that Petrified Skull should pretty much universally always be the pick if you get that, because it is actually very powerful for this class. The number one problem, we'll get to this in I think the next slide, but number one problem, especially for the Harvest Rector, is killing tanks, and Petrified Skull just makes that easy. And if you didn't know, it says Purge here, but if you wait like 2 or 3 floors, I think 3 floors, I think, you don't play it, it gives you this relic that basically removes Purge from all your cards and just turns it into Consume. Now once that happens, you can actually slap Eternal Stone on it, and then it's a card that just sort of is in your deck and able to play over and over again. And it also gives you, you know, Eternal Stone's kind of a dud most of the time, I find, but it gives you more consistency in your Magic Merchants. Just something worth mentioning. But you know, then it also has the flexibility of being able to kill your own units as well. It's actually very good for that. It's Crushing Demise, but non-random. You know what I mean? And it's hard to really differentiate between all 3 of these, which is better. You're kind of, they're all so good. Subsiding Blade, we talked about Crushing Demise. I don't really have much more to go over there. What I will say is, as great as it is for killing enemies, it's more useful for killing your own units. That should kind of outline the strategy a bit, or kind of speak to the strategy maybe a little bit. The fact that this is more useful for killing your own units than the enemy kind of just says how important it is for units to be constantly dying so that they can reform more often. Because remember, the more they reform, the more stats they get, and the more burnout they're accumulating, so that once you end up fighting the boss, you have a pretty significant amount of burnout, such that you typically don't want burnout to be the reasons your units are dying on the boss. You want enough burnout that they're being killed, like from their HP being lost. And if that's the case, you're just never going to lose the boss fights. Even the final Seraph, you're pretty much guaranteed to win in that scenario. Subsiming Blade is probably one of the most low-key overlooked cards. At least it was for me. It didn't take me, I want to say it took me long, but once I started using it, it didn't take me long to realize actually how freaking good this card is. Because it doesn't really look that good on paper, right? Like, it's like 2 energy. It starts out with pretty low, like a ridiculously low damage for 2 energy, but one thing that you can't ignore here is the fact that energy upgrades are cheap and they're always guaranteed. So it's really not hard to make this just cost 1 or even 0. The ideal situation, so with any of like these two especially, you're going to want holdover on them and an energy upgrade. That's like the 2 things you want here. But, if you don't end up getting holdover and subsiming Blade, just making it cost 0 is good enough usually. You're going to have enough card drive by the end that it's pretty often being drawn. And yeah, it just keeps gaining damage. There's no need to add any damage upgrade to this. I'd say that's usually a mistake. And really, the earlier you get it, the better. The only time I really skip it is if it's like the very final circle. Even sometimes I still take it then, though. But all that being said, like, you're usually looking at 30 to 40 damage on average, I would say, by the time you get to the final game. Often quite more, but I'm just kind of giving a general ballpark. And there's not many DPS, like the good DPS units are all going to die to that. So you can easily kill your own units with it, but then it's also pretty flexible in its ability to target and kill enemy units, especially the fact that its piercing is often overlooked. Piercing goes through all armor, so those big like square bird units that can be pretty annoying, you just delete them. It also goes through damage shield and spell shield, so like if you took on that trial, you don't got to worry about it with this. You can still use it to kill a unit. So that's kind of the deal there. Those are the best ones to kill your own units with. And then there's also some decent options. Vine Grasp, this was one that took me a while to realize that it's just a pretty solid overall card. The one thing I will say with it is generally you're looking to want to just put 2 plus 10 damage upgrades on it. At 23 damage, it's definitely nowhere near these cards in terms of its ability to kill your own units. However, it's still going to be able to do it up to a certain point. And, using like an Animus of Will, for example, it's got to be a pretty long fight and a lot of reforms to get to the point where 23 damage can't kill her. And by then, you're probably good anyway. So it's not like it's a huge negative that it only does 23. I'd say the more negative is just that once you get to 23, that's 2 upgrades, so you can't really put on holdover or anything like that. But it still qualifies it to the decent category. It's also very flexible in killing enemy units. Beyond just getting to the back line, it can kind of pull some tanky unit to the front. Because remember, especially if you're the Burnout Rector, you're doing a lot of damage to the front row. And if you have a situation where like you have like a Gilded Wing in the back or something, you can just pull them forward and do work on them. And Rail Spikes is similar to Skull. You're not seeing it that often, but usually I'm going to take Rail Spikes if I see it. If you can somehow get a plus 10 damage upgrade on it before you start copying them, that'll go a long ways to helping it out. Because remember, with a plus 10 damage upgrade, you can play it at 0 energy, and it'll just still do 10 damage. And then beyond that, if you have some damage, or if you have some energy, which often you do, like I can't tell you how many times by the end of the game I literally have every card at 0 cost. So if you have extra energy, you can do, you know, around 30 to 40 damage, which is definitely enough to kill your own units. So Rail Spikes is pretty good. And then Wax and Spike, it's an interesting one. It's never going to be your top tier type of card, but it is a card that just kind of helps you along a lot of the time. Like, this is not an end game card I'm usually adding, but more of an early to mid game card if I see it and I think I might need it. So like a lot of the times, your DPS unit, if you don't have a way to kill it, and especially if they don't have, you know, the burnout upgrade, this is a card that can get that started. So let's say I had, you know, a molded on Reform, but I didn't really have any way to, I didn't have any of these cards, right? I didn't have Vine Grasp, I didn't have Subsonic Blade, I didn't have any of that. I really want a way to get my DPS unit dead without just sort of weirdly sacrificing him. And Wax and Spike's a great way to do that. I can just play that, they'll die the turn, you know, that turn, after already getting their damage in. And then they have a permanent damage upgrade if you spent any energy on it. Even if you didn't, you can still play it at 0 to get your main desired effect here, which is to add that burnout 1. And then they'll die that turn, and then from then on out, you have it on a holdover, so you can start your reform process. So, you know, it's not the top tier like these, but certainly actually a pretty solid card. And then if you're desperate, these could always be an option to particularly get your DPS unit. Or if you took Harvest Rector, it could also work there, because it's not as good as Wax and Spike, you gotta remember, because it's 2 turns before they die, so that's an additional turn, which it's enough that it's relevant in a lot of fights, especially in mid to, especially the non, like, you know, there's the 3 really big boss fights where they go on longer, but especially in those early to mid circles, the fights don't really last that long, and an entire extra turn of them not being able to die and be reformed is somewhat significant. So these are certainly not the great options at it, but they are options. I'm never really adding these to my deck unless I'm desperate, right? But that being said, you know, often these are in your starting hand, and they can be options. It's worth noting that they can be options to kind of get some of this going. They're just not really great late game options. So now we're looking at what are the good DPS options for your DPS unit. Well, Animus of Will I think is the best. I've often thought between Bounty Stalker and Animus of Will, which one's better. Bounty Stalker has the higher ceiling, but it's a ceiling that you just don't need. When you have Animus of Will, you have such a guaranteed good unit. And the great thing about Animus of Will is she really doesn't need expensive upgrades to make her good. You know, almost every other unit here wants to see the multi-strike upgrade, even Bounty Stalker, to really shine. I mean, Bounty Stalker can get by not needing it, but he sure would love it. It doubles his power. Whereas Animus of Will, she'll still take a multi-strike. Like, it's not bad on her, but she just doesn't need it. Like, I would say the most common Animus of Will I have is 1 plus 10 damage upgrade, and then 1 burnout upgrade. So you know that the +1 burnout, and then 5 and 5 attack damage, 5 health. That is actually a top tier add for almost any of these. In any unit here that does not have burnout by default, that is like an upgrade that you want to be searching for it, and B, you want to be holding out for it. So like, you don't want to fill up all your slots and not have that, especially on like Animus of Will. There's some exceptions to that, but if we're talking about the general game plan for all of these should be to add that burnout upgrade, you know, aside from like Draft and Lady of the House, since they already have burnout. But yeah, so Animus of Will, you know, they just really, all they need is that burnout upgrade, and then either a +10 damage or a multi-strike are really just icing in the cake. They almost don't even need those. They really don't need anything depending on your cards, but just the burnout usually helps. Bounty Stalker. And I put Dante here, which might be a little misleading because I generally don't think the actual event to get him is worth it. I would only do it if you're pretty confident that you can make it through. Like you're sitting in a pretty good split state and you can deal with the Dante's candles in your deck. In that case, if you can take it, you're pretty much ensuring your victory because Dante is, you know, as insane as Animus of Will is, even Dante's like even that much more insane, right? So, yeah, it's worth mentioning that Dante is obviously God tier if you can get him, but I wouldn't reach for him. Let's put it that way. Bounty Stalker. The thing with Bounty Stalker is with Reform, and especially, you know, if you have Reform and ways to kill your units, you're bringing him back so much. Like, he's extinguishing so many times that, like, he just gets to these ridiculous damage levels. Like, I've had him usually up to like 200 or 300 damage, sometimes with multi-strike. Like, that's pretty insane, right? But I will say it can be a little awkward to get him going sometimes if you don't have a lot of the pieces. Like, a lot of times, because the stealth makes it hard for him to just sort of die a lot of the times. If you're looking to put him in front of a bunch of enemies just to get that first death in. But there's not much I can complain about Bounty Stalker. He's still just a god tier DPS option. Another quick note I want to add. You'll notice the space never goes to 3 on any of these choices. That's a pretty big thing because you don't want to really take up space. On top of the most of the 3 space units just not necessarily providing any more DPS, even if they did, I wouldn't take them. Like, if these god tier options, if any of them was 3 space, I would actually just, they wouldn't make this list. Let's put it that way, because you need to be able to reform units on every single floor, and I really don't want to have to add space if I don't have to. I often already have to add space with Harvest Rector a lot of the time, and having a 3 space unit just makes that even worse. And that being said, we move on to the decent tier here, and you'll notice 2 of these are basically drafts, which take up 1 space. And I will say both of these, if they were, they're the only 2 units / cards in this list that are not banner units. I wish they were. If they were, they would be in god tier. But the only thing that holds them back is the fact that they're not banner units. So, and I wish, you know, I'll just throw this out there. I really wish that there was an upgrade like for the magic merchant that either made a spell innate, like just guaranteed to be in your starting hand, or at the very least made it like a banner spell, like if there was such a thing. I think that would be cool. It would make something like Sacrificial Resurrection god tier. That being said, it's a very good card. It's a card I'm less happy to see against the version of Seraph that devours your spells, but I'll still not shy away from taking it if I need it. And as for the other Seraphs, I'm even less inclined to shy away from it because this card can really do wonders for thinning out your deck, and then also just providing yourself with an amazing DPS option. There's some situations, because the draft only takes up 1 space, you can sometimes justify a draft along with another DPS unit. There's going to be one floor where you can't fit them all in, but especially for like the Harvest Rector strategy, you often do need like 2 DPS units, and that's where these type of units really shine. Drafts and Sacrificial Resurrection. It's also worth noting Sacrificial Resurrection can consume, you know, blight cards and whatnot, so you know, your dead weights can just get consumed out of your deck, and you just end up with this super thin, super consistent deck that doesn't even need like holdover or anything like that. But yeah, they're, you know, they take up a low amount of space, they have a low amount of health, high amount of multi-strike damage. That's everything you'd want from a DPS unit here. Paraffin Thug kind of fits that too. It doesn't have the multi-strike, but it has a decent amount of damage, has that low amount of health, and also has a really nice slay. I often really love to have Paraffin Thug early on because he's very common for an early on ad. So, you know, if I didn't get like Animus of Will or whatnot, but I saw Paraffin Thug, I'd take him. And he's a unit that's good enough to be your end game DPS option as long as you get multi-strike. If you can't get multi-strike, you're going to have a rough time, but you know, you're getting gold from him. If you get multi-strike, it makes it easier to find multi-strike because you should have enough gold to hopefully re-roll. And also, once you get multi-strike, you just keep chugging in the gold because now you can get 40 gold each turn. And I will say also, it's not uncommon for me to start Paraffin Thug and later find like Animus of Will or Bounty Stalker and just simply remove the Thug. That's totally fine too. He's done his job early on. And I usually, you don't need to remove him till like the very final floor. Like, it's fine to not guarantee your other DPS sometimes, as long as you already have it. If you have two good options at DPS, I would maybe just wait till Seraph to remove the worser option, just to guarantee the good one for that fight. But up until then, it might kind of even just help you because you may not have all of the cards needed to really take care of a lot of floors, and just having an extra DPS unit can kind of help sometimes there. Now, Paraffin Enforcer, this is a card that if you can get the, you know, for both these cards, all of them really, as I said, you want that burnout upgrade for the unit, and also multi-strike. You can really see a difference in power level in Paraffin Enforcer when you have both of them. Because when you have both, not only is it now made him right off the bat a burnout unit, so he's giving himself rage, but the fact that he's multi-striking, you know, say you have the burnout version of Rector, or even the harvest version of Rector, but you're kind of reforming him so he has burnout at that point, you're adding 12 damage. If you're multi-striking, you're adding 6 rage, you're adding 12 damage each turn. Granted, it's not permanent damage, but that's still like 12 damage that will be relevant until the point they either die or burn out. That's a pretty insane amount of damage. So Paraffin Enforcer is actually very good, but the initial add of him might be a little weak, especially if you're, you know, he's much more enticing for the burnout version of Rector, but you know, don't shy away from taking him from Harvest either. Then these are the desperate options. Desperate might be, I just wanted to be like, you know, consistent between some of the terms here. But I wouldn't say these are necessarily desperate ads. They're actually all pretty fine as well. My general rule, I would say, is like, if it's the first few circles, I might just hold off from adding these unless I really needed it to get through the next few circles. Otherwise, I'd probably just want to hold out for a better DPS unit. But if it's, you know, if you need an immediate unit, or if it's getting late and you're kind of getting to the point where you're not really going to get offered many more banner units, it's time to start thinking about getting a unit like this. So Wickless Baron actually has the potential to be quite insane, but really needs multi-strike. If you don't have multi-strike, it can be rough with Wickless Baron. And it's also pretty hard because he gains a lot of health, which makes it pretty hard for him to die. So, you know, you really need either a way to put burnout on him or just one of those sort of unconditional kill cards like Crushing Demise or whatnot to kill him, because he can be pretty hard to, he'll get pretty tanky. I do find him, he's pretty alright with the Harvest Rector, but if you do end up having the both of them, there's kind of two strategies there. You either need to upgrade your space so you can fit them both on one floor, or if it's like a weird situation where you never really found reform or anything, you might just need to put one of them kind of on 2 different floors and try to stack the both of them up. That's a much harder strategy to pull off, usually a losing strategy, I'd say. But in general, you know, he doesn't start with much damage. He has a lot of health which grows. It's nice that his damage grows, but the health growing is actually quite a negative aspect for in my opinion, the ideal strategy of Melting Remnant. That being said, he's always an option. Lady of the House has somewhat similar problems. A lot of health, so hard to really force a kill on her. She does start with burnout, which is nice, but it's a lot of burnout, so it's not like she's gonna like die that much in any fight. Usually it's like just once. But that being said, she almost doesn't need to die that much since she already has burnout. So it's like when you reform her, she's gonna stay with a pretty high amount of burnout. She just might not end up with like that insane of stats. But you know, if you slap a multi-strike on her, she can be pretty fine. She'll carry you through the early to mid game for sure. She's definitely strong on the early and mid game. It's not uncommon for me also if I'm struggling to just add Lady of the House early and get me through a few circles and then find like an Animus of Will or something later on and just remove her. Animus of Speed is an interesting one. Very similar stats to like what I've already deemed as a good you know, DPS unit in Paraffin Thug. Actually, it does more damage. The main problem here, it's not really the money. The money's just a nice to have. The main problem here is the quickness. I don't know why this unit is quick. Like it's rare that the fights in the game have the squishies in front or the glass cannons in front. Like putting her on quick really doesn't make much sense. It especially doesn't make much sense though, in particular if you have Burnout Rector, which you should be targeting most of the time. Because Burnout Rector does so much upfront damage that he's going to kill the front unit. So Animus of Speed in that scenario really, unless she has enough damage to kill the front unit, is not actually adding one bit of damage. That's kind of the main problem with her. Because you want your DPS unit behind, but she can work a little bit more in a weird scenario where you like put her further up and then finish units with it. But in either case, she doesn't fit super well into the strategy, but she is an option. If you need a DPS unit, she will work. It's just gonna be awkward to make her really work that well. Shattered Shell is an interesting one. I like it a lot more for Harvest Rector than I do for Burnout Rector. For Burnout Rector, I feel like I can pretty much always find a better DPS option. However, sometimes it's just the one you get stuck with. The thing that I guess sucks about this dude is he kind of starts off with pretty low damage, similar to Wickless Baron. As far as like gaining damage, I'd say Wickless, they're pretty similar in how much damage they'll gain. Wickless has the advantage of, you know, especially in like a Harvest Rector build, you know, if you have a Tomb unit or even a Drag die, he'll get that extra damage, whereas Shattered Shell won't. However, Shattered Shell is AoE, and a lot of times you're not killing the squishies with, if you're like doing, for instance, Baron along with the Rector on the same floor. Whereas Shattered Shell, he'll clean up all those back units, so he'll probably on average gain a little bit more damage, but it's not enough to be super relevant. I think at the end of the day, Shattered Shell and Wickless Baron kind of do around the same amount of damage in terms of just to the mobs. And Wickless is probably a little bit better against the bosses because he can survive a few more extra hits, but it's not like it's not super relevant. Shattered Shell, it's also just an option when you find that you need AoE. I don't find that you need AoE as much with this combo than compared to like the need for killing tanks, but it happens every now and then. It's worth mentioning that Shattered Shell is an option for that. And on that same note, I didn't list Husk. You'd have to be really desperate for Husk to be your option, but Husk basically just, in the context of this, is so much worse than Shattered Shell. It's harder, he has higher health, so it's harder to kill him, and he doesn't actually gain, you know, the damage. So Husk I don't really ever target, I'd say. Some rare times I will target him for Harvest Rector, but it's probably not worth calling out here. Buff your DPS. This is a pretty simple slide, but Razor Sharp Edge is the best that you can find. On top of just you don't really care about your own unit's health, especially your DPS unit. In some ways it can almost kind of help you kill it sometimes, but the extra 10 damage is insane. The more multi-strike you have, it's, you know, multiplying that by however much multi-strike you have. Animus of Will has 3 strikes by default, so it's an extra 30 damage per time that you do that. Pretty insane card. You should also keep in mind, if it's early to mid game, you can often kill an enemy unit by just you know, casting this on them. So like you're fighting Daedalus, you know, it comes in with a damage shield, bomb or whatever. You can just cast this on it. It takes its health down past 0, so it just dies. Same goes, like if there's like a haste unit, you don't want the unit to like haste past everything. Or granted, with this strategy, you don't really have units on other floors. I should also mention, you know, you typically don't want you're playing your Dregs and your Tomb units on other floors just to finish things, but come boss fight time, you want all your floors to be pretty clear. That way you don't screw yourself out of being able to reform the units up each floor. So, and then on the decent end, we have Sharpen. Sharpen's a pretty flexible card in general, but if we're talking strictly about buffing your DPS, I'd say it's only kind of middle of the road. Like the 4 damage is nowhere near Razor Sharp Edge. It also costs extra. The nice thing about Sharpen, I guess, is that it serves multiple purposes. You can either use it on your DPS unit to give them a spike of damage, or permanent, not a spike, but a permanent spike of damage. And then you could also use it on your frontliner. In particular, the Harvest Rector likes to have this on him. And then all the AoE little low HP minions are just slamming themselves into you and giving you harvest stacks. Steel Enhancer, it's not great, but it'll do. Like, it's nice that it costs 0 now. You can just, I rarely will add it to my deck, but if I really need some sort of buff for my, like if I didn't get a Razor Sharp Edge, I didn't get any of this stuff, Steel Enhancer can work. You know, it's 3 damage. We don't really care about the health, but 0 energy for 3 extra damage is not the worst thing in the world. I would say it's not really in the desperate realm. It's just sort of decent. And Wax and Spike in the same regard. It's like, it gives you a pretty good amount of damage sometimes, and it also, you know, there's kind of a hybrid thing going on here in the fact that it gives the burnout. It's also nice because if you're, you know, if your unit, if you're wanting your unit to burn out, adding 1, let's say they already had like 1 burnout. The reason I think Waxen is still better than Wick Slash is that it only adds 1 extra, whereas Wick Slash adds 2 extra for about the same damage. You know, Wick Slash gives a little bit more damage for 1, but it's kind of whatever. The thing that sucks about Wick Slash is that just extends the amount of time that your unit's not gonna die. Because a lot of times, you know, we talked about being able to kill your own units. It's especially like mid game, early to mid game, you may not have any of that. Sometimes by end game you don't have it either, but in those cases, burnout's really your only way to kill your units. So there is a certain amount of managing that has to happen. And then also a big thing, one of the real, you know, beyond Animus of Will, another reason, and Razor Sharp Edge, another thing I really like about Awoken as a secondary is the sheer amount of drawing that they can do. And really, most of the time, it's going to come down to these 2 cards, Invigorating Solution and Preserved Thorns. They're both amazing cards for drawing through your deck, getting to your card, because you know, in any fight, you want to get to your key cards as soon as possible. You want to get to those reform cards. You want to get to those kill your own unit type cards in particular. And there's a lot of purposes, even beyond drawing cards, that these can do. Particularly Preserved Thorns. Like if you're fighting the spell consumption version of Seraph, it's, you know, it's something that already consumes anyway, so you can just consume it, and then you don't have to consume your other spells. And then once you cycle back in, you have 3 additional spells that are 0 energy. You can use them to get consumed and then just draw an extra card the following turn. Just amazing cards. pretty hard for me to ever pass any of these up. Like, I can't think it. Like, I would never straight up skip these cards. Let's put it that way. You can't have too many of these cards in your deck. Vine Mother is an interesting one. Like, this one, maybe instead of saying decent, maybe it should be like situational. But I probably would never add this for the burnout version of Rector unless I had a Crushing Demise that I could like reliably play. But even then, I don't know if I need it. This really shines more for Harvest Rector. The thing is, like, it's basically a free draw upgrade from the turn you play it on out. And that can allow you, because a lot of times Harvest really does need a space upgrade, sometimes even 2 space upgrades to properly work with the Harvest Rector. Because you really need, a lot of times, to place several tomb units or just stack a floor up with 3 banner units and then still be able to use tombs on that floor. Like, all of these things are not that uncommon. And if you have a Vine Mother, that on top of just giving you a little bit of damage every turn, it gives you an extra draw every turn from after the, I guess 2 turns after you play it. Which is certainly not that bad. And it also is a unit that, because Harvest Rector really struggles with killing tanks, so on top of giving a little bit of damage to the, the tanks, and by the way, there's obviously those 2 Sting Relics that can greatly help the damage of this thing. You're much more enticed to take them if you see those relics. But another thing that's somewhat overlooked with Vine Mother is, like, you're usually putting her on either the 2nd or 3rd floor, or the top floor or the middle floor, and she can, if you have that card, what is it, Rejuvenation Bomb or whatever, she'll get hit, and every turn after that, there's the potential to do a ton of damage to a tank, because she has high enough health that she can survive a few hits, and then once you have that low amount of health, especially if you have like a +10 damage upgrade on one of those Rejuvenation Bombs, you'll just one-shot even like a Gilded Wing, honestly. Like, you won't one-shot him, but you can do 100 damage to him, which is huge, right? Especially on a class that struggles so much at killing tanks. So Vine Mother, low-key, actually a pretty good add, but not one I'm necessarily always looking for. It's one I would say, if you see it, think about it. Just think about it and think if it could be like the missing puzzle piece for your deck at the moment. But I wouldn't really think about it if I took Burnout Rector. Let's put it that way. It's really only a Harvest Rector option. And on the same veins, these would really only be taken for Harvest Rector, because Harvest Rector, as we've said, often has to take space upgrades instead of draw upgrades. And in those cases, putting a Wildwood Custodian down to draw each turn, that can work. It doesn't give you the added benefit that Vine Mother gives in a lot of ways, but at least it actually draws cards sooner than Vine Mother does, so that's one positive for it. Awoken Rail Spike, most of your cards are usually 0 cost anyway, so it still is like a way to draw cards, but I don't think it's super great, but it is an option if you really need it. And Focus Growth, the same, like, it's normally a pretty good card outside of this Melting Remnant main and Awoken strategy, but 2 energy, the health really is not relevant, because as we've said, we really just don't care about the health of our units. In a lot of cases, we want them just to die. So restoring 25 health is hardly ever relevant. Draw 2 next turn is nice, but at that energy cost, it's not necessarily that worth it. It's pretty outshined by cards like this. All that being said, if you went Harvest Rector, sometimes Harvest Rector does like to see the heal, and also it usually likes to see the draw, especially when you do the space upgrade, so it's not completely out of the question for Harvest Rector. And then kill tanks. Kill tanks. I put Harvest Rector especially. It's not 100% true, but then with Burnout Rector, you're always killing that first tank no matter what. but that's not a guarantee that the follow-up tanks that often exist won't be killed either. It's just, in particular, Harvest Rector struggles a lot more with tanks because he's not, at least in the first few rounds, his damage isn't high. It only gets high once he's got a significant amount of harvests, so he especially wants to have ways to kill tanks. That's really, like, Harvest Rector, the reason I lose most of my Harvest Rector runs is because the tanks, in particular Gilded Wings, just sort of march on up the floors without dying and have their way with my pyre. So really you want to be on the lookout for these type of cards. So Remnant Host, both Remnant Host and Entombed Explosive are pretty similar. They're a tomb unit, very good in Harvest Rector builds, but still plenty fine in your normal Burnout Rector builds. Like, these units, you place them up above second and third floor sometimes, and they'll just clean up those tanks that made it through. With Harvest Rector, you're usually wanting to combo them right on the floor that you have your Harvest Rector. Remnant Host is particularly insanely good with Harvest Rector. That's 3 harvests usually. I mean, usually it's going to die, and then usually the drafts they're going to die or they're going to burn out, because they always come in with that 1 burnout. So that's, you know, assuming that the drafts don't get killed, you're looking at 40 damage there, which is pretty close to the 50. Doesn't always get that off, but you're usually looking at least 20 damage, which is nothing to laugh at. And the extra harvest that it gives is really the main thing there. But it's still good at killing tanks. Like you know, using the scenario of like a tank got past your bottom floor or whatever and needs to be finished off. Usually it's just the tank alive, and then you'll just have the Remnant Host able to do its full 40 damage, and that's often enough to at least, if not kill the tank, bring it down to enough health that it saves your pyre that extra HP that it needs. And Entombed's pretty similar. It won't give you as much harvest stacks, but it does so much damage that you almost don't care. Like, it's just one of the most versatile cards for the class. It's rare that I'll see Entombed Explosive and not take it, especially with harvest. There's probably some situations with the Burnout Rector I wouldn't take it, but only if I just didn't need it. And then we've already kind of talked about Crushing Demise. It fills so many, just does so many things and does them so well, but you're hard pressed to find much that kills tanks better than Crushing Demise. Really just Petrified Skull would be it. Subsiding Blade, you know, we talked about this card before, but it can get up to around 50 damage, which is pretty good at finishing off tanks. But even beyond that, the fact that it can kill those high armor, low HP units just in one shot usually is all it takes to be able to kill the tank that's behind it. Because a very, very common scenario is you have one of those like 100 armor tank units and they're protecting like a Gilded Wing or something. And Subsiding Blade just deletes that unit in front of them so that your other units can hammer that tank. Memento Mori is also okay. It's a lot of energy and it needs setup to be able to really use, but come, you know, by mid round to late, mid fight to late fight, this thing's doing a lot of damage usually, especially in a harvest build. There's not a tank in the game that can really survive your typical Memento Mori hit. The only thing that sucks though is like drawing it early sucks. Drawing it when you don't have the energy to play it sucks. That's kind of just the main issue with Memento Mori. And then Steel Pulley Claws is pretty good. The energy cost is a little high, but and the fact that it consumes itself is like, it's whatever. But I often refer to Steel Pulley Claws kind of a get out of jail free card. It's you know, your pyre at whatever point the game is at is doing a lot of damage if you times it by 3, and most tanks aren't going to survive that. Probably only a Gilded Wing at full health is really going to survive that, and even then you're greatly reducing the damage they were going to do to you. So Steel Pulley Call is just a very versatile thing, but still you'd probably rather have these for killing tanks. These ones, I kind of weirdly put them in between these two. if I could make another column here and call it situational, I'd probably put these two, because obviously they need certain situations to actually do their damage. But if you have those situations, they're amazing at killing tanks. So if you have a few sharpens in particular, Bramble Lash can do some serious work against tanks. I mean, you're looking at 100 or more damage. You know, you place Sharpen double stacked plus another Sharpen that's not double stacked. That is already over 100 damage for Bramble Lash. And same for Restoration Detonation. As we talked about before, like, there are times with Harvest Rector where it makes sense to get maybe a Vine, whatever it was, the Vine Mother unit, or even like some tanky unit, or just the Harvest Rector itself, and you're going to have situations where you have a unit that has a lot of missing health. Even like a Hollow isn't out of the question to add if you already have this Restoration Detonation in your deck. And in those cases, you're just doing a lot of damage to the front unit. And then in the Desperate column, I have Mortal Entrapment. This is a card that it really sucks, but if you can manage to afford a double stack and an energy, either both a double stack or just like maybe a permafrost on it. Double stack is the main thing, and it needs double stack to really work. And then the other upgrade is just whatever. You can upgrade it with whatever else. I usually say just energy upgrade, but at Dazed 4, it can do things. At Dazed 2, it's kind of just whatever. But you know, at Dazed 4, if you play this on a tank on the top floor, well, it's pretty much a still holy call at that point, right? Like they'll enter that fight with Dazed 3, and you even added an extra 25 damage. So if you have the money, that's a lot of money to invest in a card just to make it kind of okay. That's why the card kind of sucks, but it's not completely useless. It is an option. Like I said, if you're desperate, it's there, and sometimes you need it. I've definitely taken it before and not been happy about it, but it's been the thing I've needed to win a run. You gotta, you know, with all of these things, remember, let's go back to this, like, you know, I kind of line them out in the order of what you kind of need to look for, these roles to fill in your deck. So the very first thing, the top priority is to get this Reform. Then close behind on the second priority is to get ways to kill your units. And then it's a DPS unit is probably the next priority. Buff your units. I could probably actually, I should have probably said kill tanks is the next there, and then I would keep everything else the same, because kill tanks, in particular for Harvest, it's gonna be the thing that you're gonna struggle with. But we've kind of beat that to death. AoE damage, this is less important, I find, typically, than killing tanks, but it's not something that should be completely ignored. What I will say is if you find yourself not needing AoE, don't add it just to add it. Even these god tier options, like Glimmer is a really good card, but if you don't need any AoE, there's no sense in adding Glimmer. We'll get to this point later, but just to note it, there's kind of this concept of fluff. Fluff is just any card you don't absolutely need. And for this strategy to consistently work, you really got to limit the amount of fluff in your deck. You don't like I skip a lot of cards. Like you should, like I really recommend. I can only outline so much by just talking about it here. I would really recommend watching my videos to get the full picture of this in action. Particularly if you watch the most recent videos, like on that win streak I had. Most of them, like to a T, outline this whole strategy just sort of in actual practice, but you'll notice I skip a lot of cards, probably more than I take. I'd like to actually, I wish there was a good way for me to analyze that data. I'd be interested to see, but anyway, AoE damage, if you need it, just like tanks, Harvest wants it more, especially like early on. So like early on, your Harvest Rector doesn't really have much damage, but if you can get a few good AoE shots in, either through Thorns or Glimmer, or even like, you know, any of these things really, you're gonna greatly spike the stats on your Harvest Rector, and pretty soon that he'll be up to where the Burnout Rector is, and then eventually even surpass that. The more AoE you have, the more chance there is for that. So AoE, you know, it's really good for Harvest Rector, and it's sometimes needed for Burnout, but not always. I would say I am almost never adding these things right here for Burnout Rector. Sometimes I'll add Fatal Melting, but anyway, we'll just go through them really quick. Glimmer, it's really good. It really likes to see a +10 damage upgrade to truly shine, but you know, early game, 2 health is going to kill most of the low health minions. You just, by mid to end game, it'd be nice to have it being doing 12 damage. The heal you don't care too much about, so you're only really getting the AoE benefit out of it, but it turns out that that's really good anyway. And Sharpen, and I would also like to really quick mention, there's obviously that the Sword of whatever, that's the other option, one of the other options in this event. I purposely did not list it here because I really don't recommend ever getting to this cavern and not taking Petrified Skull. I can't think of any reason that you should ever not take Petrified Skull with this combo. It's just too important to everything that this class wants to do. So just thought I'd note that. And then Sharpen, as I said before, it's pretty flexible, but whereas it's more decent for adding you know, just DPS, it's actually god tier in terms of its AoE, especially if you can get a double stack. 4 spikes can be a little awkward sometimes when you're talking about a lot of these 5 HP type enemies in the game. However, that's not the common case. Most of them are like between 1 and 2 to 3 HP, and 4 spikes is just enough to get that job done. But you know, it's a great double stack target if you do get offered double stack and you got the money to spend. Getting a Harvest Rector in particular with all these spikes just greatly increases how fast and quickly that unit can grow. And it's also like, if you have a pretty high stat Harvest Rector with a lot of spikes on it, you can usually get by killing a boss without really having to reform up each floor. Now in the decent tier, we got these 2 units and then Fatal Melting. Fatal Melting is kind of, in my opinion, just a poor man's Glimmer. It costs 2 energy, which already is a strike against it, against Glimmer. But then it also needs some conditions for it to actually do damage. So if you draw it in your opening hand and you don't have any damage upgrade on it, it actually can't do any damage. Whereas like a Glimmer without a damage upgrade could still kill the 2 health units. But all that being said, if you just slap a +10 damage upgrade on Fatal Melting, and then you could also slap a energy upgrade, it becomes pretty much as good as Glimmer. It just needs a little bit more to get it going. And you know, by a very late game, it's doing more damage than Glimmer, or by, you know, late round or whatever. But in AoE, it's just not that relevant to do a lot of AoE damage. That's why you'll also not notice that one, the Devourer of Soul unit or whatever, is not listed here. I really just don't think that unit makes any sense, but we'll get to all that later. So Shattered Shell and Husk Hermit, they're pretty similar in this category. You know, this is not really the DPS category. This is like, I need AoE. Here's some options. And obviously, these units especially would probably mainly be used for Harvest Rector. If you can put like a quick on them, it's even better in that situation, because then you're killing all of the squishy units before they can even hit your units. Come mid to late round, that doesn't matter too much, but there are some times that, let's say you want to put your Harvest Rector in front and either Husk Hermit or Shattered Shell behind. If you have quick on them, that's going to prevent like your Harvest Rector from just dying in the early game, because that is a danger sometimes, especially if it's like the sap version of Seraph, where they have the 15 × 2 damage dudes. You're really going to want quick in that case, because you want to prevent that damage to allow yourself to get off to a good start. In that same vein, Thorned Hollow kind of does the same role as these, except the main thing that sucks about him is he takes up 3 space, so that's a huge strike actually against him. Space is a commodity that's tough to come by, right? And you also generally need to rejuvenate him a few times to really get the amount of spikes required to do much with him. Well, all that being said, if you're pretty low pyre health and you're just gonna die to any AoE and you see Thorn Hollow come up, might as well take him. I mean, you might as well give yourself a shot at winning, right? Same goes with pyre shards. It's really not as good. Like it consumes itself, so it's like if you didn't have any spikes at all, 4 usually isn't enough. I mean, the thing with Sharpen is you can cycle back into it and keep reapplying it. And if you did have enough spikes already, well, you don't need pyre shards then. At that point, it kind of falls into fluff. But all that being said, as we've said, 4 spikes does deal with a lot of enemies in the game. And if you're in the same situation that you are with Thorn Hollow, where you're about dead and you need to get some sort of AoE, like pyre shards is an option. That's an okay option to do. Now we'll talk about the Melting Remnant specific artifacts. And you could almost argue that all of them are situational to some degree, but I figured there's enough difference between them that I can categorize them and how I think of them. So this I don't know the names of all these, so I'm just going to say what they do. So this artifact, this is the best one you can really find. It's going to add +10 damage to every reformed unit, which is pretty insanely good. I mean, it essentially just turned all of your moldeds into low-cost Wicked Blazes, and your Wicked Blazes into like doubling their effect. It's just insanely good. Pretty hard to beat that. You're gonna have, especially if you're like reforming some Animus of Will action, like just stupidly powerful. And this gold one, you could argue it's situational in that you obviously wouldn't want to add this as like if you're in the final circle, but usually I think you're all smart enough to know that in the general sense, it's very good. If you get it anywhere early to mid game, between just simply the dregs dying, but also, if it's early game, you still got stewards. If you happen to get tomb units, you got tomb units. If you're reforming and killing your units a lot, you're just, every time that happens, 5 gold. That's an amazingly powerful relic. And then this one, it sort of, you just play a unit and randomly reduces things to 0. You're generally not strapped for energy with this class by the end game, but 1 out of 3 times you are going to face Ember Drain Seraph. So something like this can still help end game in that type of situation. But even beyond that, just on the journey along, like early to mid game, you're not really going to have everything. You're not going to have a lot of your energy reduction costs purchased yet, and this card basically makes them kind of pseudo purchased already, because you just put down a drag and boom, you lose the energy on that card, and it's just really powerful, just kind of always good. And same with this card here, this artifact here. So basically, any unit with burnout, when they die, will do 5 damage to all enemies, which basically means that every drag at the minimum is now a 5 damage AoE bomb, and that's just insanely good, especially early to mid game. But at any stage of the game, that's great. Even if you're against Seraph and he's spawning in light wings on the top floor, you can just stick down a drag and boom, kills the light wing for no energy at all. Now situational, these are ones that they can definitely shine when given the chance, but they're not always ones you want to pick. So this one right here, it gives extra extinguish triggers, which is typically mainly useful for your tomb units, but there's other units that can work on too, like your bounty stalker, for example. But it's not necessarily needed for that, but it for tomb units in particular, it really can make them a lot more powerful. Like, some people might say this is like win more. I would disagree with that, because if I was Harvest Rector, for example, and I'm struggling with killing tanks, well, literally doubling the value of my tomb units, in particular the exploding one and even the one that summons dregs, like, you're doubling the effectiveness of them. That's usually enough to just kill out any tanks that are there, and then you'll just never take pyre damage. Now this one, the key, this is a tricky one. I like it a lot more if it's very early game and I chose Harvest Rector. In that case, I can kind of guarantee my Harvest Rector is going to be able to reform on every floor, and that alone is enough to make this relic worth it. It's less good, I feel, later on if I'm already kind of ironing out my reforming strategy. That being said, if it's mid to late game and I don't have any reforms, I might look into this. Like, it's definitely an option, even with, you know, your DPS unit. There are ways to make it work. You may have to be a little crafty, but just remember that, you know, it's the first unit you play. It'll always be endless. That can bite you though sometimes. That's the one downside of this relic. If you're heavily invested, for instance, in the reform strategy, you don't want this relic. Like, if you have a lot of consistent reform, you don't want these units that you're reforming to become endless when you, let's say you reform them like 2 times and they have burnout 2 now. You don't want a burnout 2 unit on endless, because now they'll never die. They'll never be able to be reformed. So that is one of the big downsides of this relic. In a similar sense, there's this relic that applies extra like 3 burnout anytime it's applied. This one, I see this as sort of one that I'm usually not taking, but if I need it, it can be a run saver. And the way it can be a run saver is, like, if I don't happen to have hardly any reform, this is usually, it's like, let's say I just find 1 reform card and I find it like almost to the final circle. You know, you have that trinket shop at the very end, and it's not uncommon to see like something like this. And if I couldn't find like holdover on my reform cards in that case, or reform card like singular, although I'm probably going to Helven it at the very least. In either case, this is like a great option to overcome the downside you have then, because you're not reforming enough to really get much burnout on them for the bosses. But with this, all you need is to reform a few times, or you just reform maybe once or twice, and you have up to around 6 burnout. So that's really the thing there. And as for these 3, these are like tomb related artifacts. I just don't think they're good at all. This one gives you like 5 energy when a tomb unit dies, which is like, what? The Melting Remnant doesn't need energy. You know, they have a grand total of 1 X cost card, and that X cost card doesn't really gain super insane value out of like a huge X cost on the play. And it's consumable too, so I don't know. And there's no Shadow Siege, there's no Demon Fiend, there's just nothing that really needs energy. So I don't really know why that exists. And this one also, it gives you like 30 health to your tomb units and adds burnout 1. I don't really understand why this is absolutely a downgrade in every way I can think. In what I want from a tomb unit. Like, I don't want to advance their burnout. If I happen to be reforming them, I'd much rather be able to reform them like on my initial one with just 1 burnout, lower health, and I want the initial play to be 1 health. Like, there's just it makes no sense, this relic, to me. So I would say never take these two. And this one, this is a relic that, like, it's not a bad relic, it just isn't needed. What it does is it gives you like 5 armor to the front unit whenever I think like a unit dies, or a unit with a burnout dies or something like that. Which is like, you know, it's technically good in what it does. It's just not what you ever really need. So I just never really find myself taking it. Just seems like 25 gold is pretty much more useful in every case. But, you know, this one more so than the other. These two I just think are completely useless. This one maybe has a use in some niche scenarios, but in general I would just, if you don't, I wouldn't target it, let's put it that way. These are really the ones you want to target, and then sometimes these. And moving on to Awoken artifacts, this relic is the one that adds a sting to your card, your hand every turn. That's an amazing relic. You know, it's basically like getting a free draw upgrade, and as you've seen how important draw upgrades are to this strategy, this is like about the best relic you could find. And then on top of that, it hard counters one of the 3 Seraphs, which is the Spell Devourer. It literally hard counters him. And then on top of that, it just gives you a little bit of damage here and there. At really, like, the only downside you could find to this relic is the fact that when you cycle back in, you might be cycling stings in. But I find that's really not that big of an issue. Like, it's rarely an issue. And if you have a card like Sacrificial Consumption, it's actually very huge for that card. Like, you can just end up making some huge drafts and then reforming them. Just an amazing relic. And in the same vein, I wouldn't say this, I'd still say it's like this Sprout or whatever is probably better than most of these relics, but it's definitely not on the level of this, I wouldn't say. But either way, it at least gives those, at the very least, it makes those regen basic cards actually do something for you. And not only do something, it's actually pretty good. The ability to cycle them is really good. And the thing is, that's not the only thing that's healing you all the time, right? Like, Glimmer is not that uncommon of a card to have. It makes Glimmer cycle itself. And even, trying to think, like the Restoration Bomb makes it cycle itself. So that it's just a pretty good relic that really doesn't have any downside. It almost always finds you some value. And I would never just take 25 gold over it, let's put it that way. Now these ones are kind of situational. This one, obviously, it's pretty obvious, like, do you have any relevant amount of stings or not? If not, don't take it. This one's like an okay one. Situational might not even be the right one for this particular one, but I didn't feel like it was really god tier or anything. It just applies Rooted to enemies before the Pyroom. I guess what I would say here is that it's situationally pretty good if you're having trouble killing tanks, because it can give you some extra turns to try to do something to kill those tanks. But even then, I don't know if I'd really skip this relic much of the time. There's sometimes I might think about skipping it, but not too much. Like, if I have like Drip Falls and maybe the pulley, I probably wouldn't take it. And then these are all right next to each other. They're all pretty similar. These two almost accomplish the same thing. They're just going to basically double the output on your spikes. If you think that's something that you need, then they're absolutely fine to take. I mean, I think I've seen both of these cards described as win more. I think that might be true if you're like maining Awoken, but in this case, I don't think it's true at all. I think if you have Sharpen in particular, you basically just get a free double stack upgrade on all your Sharpens by taking either of these, and that is certainly very good. That's not win more. That's more like just win, you know. And then the healing, this deal the damage that you healed, you're gonna know. Typically, I don't find you have like that many big heals, but it's not uncommon that it's not like out of the question that you do. And if you do, then that's a pretty good relic. If not, then it's useless and skip it. This is pretty much meeting the definition of situational. Rejuve bombs, really like to see this one, assuming that your rejuve bombs are actually, you know, able to hit damaged units, which usually you should be able to. Same go even for like Glimmer, in particular, and like against the not the overcharged tank, but the guy that looks like overcharged tank that does the sweeping attack. Like Glimmer can do a lot of damage in those cases, because you usually have damage on both your units, or three in the cases that you have three, and it just sort of adds all that damage up. And then this one is pretty I should have just listed this one up here, but it's the same type of deal. If you have stings, use it. If not, don't. It's pretty simple. And then these two aren't really needed. Sad that this one's not needed, because I think it's a very good relic artifact in general, but for this Melting Remnant and Awoken strategy, really just not needed. It'd be super rare the times that you'd want it, because you're really just not stacking regen ever. I guess the only time you would stack regen is if you went Harvest Rector and you never really found like a way to make him reform or make him endless. I could maybe see a situation that regen happens, but it's honestly so rare that it's not worth teasing out there. And then I don't find this artifact very good, particularly for this combo, especially considering Burnout Rector is your primary, like, you want primarily to have Burnout Rector, who does a ton of upfront damage. Usually the tanks are in front, and this relic is just going to make it so some squishy goes in front, and then the tank is just going to survive. It's almost like detrimental to your game plan, so I wouldn't really take Curse Vines. Now we'll go over the clanless ones here. There's not every artifact listed. Anything that's not listed, I've just deemed it as basically not ever really worth taking. But everything listed could serve some purpose. So the God tier ones, two of them are from Caverns, is worth mentioning, but the one, this banner one here is really good for the same reasons that, wish I knew the names of these, but the same reasons that this one is good is really the same reasons that this one can be pretty damn good. You know, it just makes it so things are free, and you can place down dregs and pretty easily make that happen. This one, a free space upgrade. Not much to say about that. It's like, you'd always like to see it, even with the Burnout champ. Like, well, I would never actually physically take a space upgrade with the Burnout champ. Having this is certainly nice. It allows you to do a few things extra that you normally wouldn't be able to do. It's kind of just nice to have, but really where it shines is Harvest Rector. With Harvest Rector, it will often allow you to take that draw upgrade that you might not have been able to take otherwise, and just make everything that much more consistent. And then this is the artifact that removes Purge. If you have this, that means that you have that card that basically just kills a unit for free. So yeah, this sort of just implies that you have that card, thus making it God tier. Situational. So this one, usually I'm taking Dripfall with a Harvest game plan. Really, Dripfall would be the only reason you'd take this one. It turns Dripfall into a pretty nice stun bomb. But that's not much to say there other than that. Otherwise, you wouldn't really take it. The Spike Strips, really all three of these. Spike Strips, the Infused Mallet, and the Advanced Prototype. The situation I would say with these is that it's early game. They're great early game cards, but they fall off pretty hard come late game. So if it's late game, I just don't really see myself needing them. I mean, obviously I wouldn't want Advanced Prototype because you don't have, you shouldn't have stewards by the time late game rolls around. And I will say, even if you do take this early on, you should still probably remove your stewards, because they're still not banner units, and they're okay. Maybe leave one around, but it's not like uncommon for me to just remove all my stewards by the end game, even if I take this early. Infused Mallet probably is the best late game compared to the other two, but it's pretty random, and it's much more useful to me to just help me get through the early game. And then these consume cards, it'll be pretty obvious to you whether on each of them, it's like, do you have a lot of consume cards? If so, then these two will be good. This one, do you have consume cards that you want to unconsume? If so, yes. I would say between these three, I would take this one the least, because often I'm adding like the consume upgrade to some cards, like the regen basic card, specifically so that I can purge it, or consume it from the deck. And I don't want them to come back in, so I'm often not taking this, but there's some situations where you might want it. And then this one, I would say I only take this one. This is the relic or artifact that makes when you play a blight card, it does 100 damage to the front unit. I would only take it A, if I was super starved for killing tanks, but more importantly, B, if I was needing, or if I was facing the Seraph that devours my spells, because that Seraph shuffles a few blights into your deck, and it turns those from a negative into actually a positive. I mean, 1 energy to deal 100 damage to the front is like totally legit. So 1 out of 3 times when I see this event, I'm pretty much auto picking this thing. But in a lot of cases, I just skip everything in this event. And then just okay. At the top, this one, I don't know, maybe I'm undervaluing I forget what it's called, like wing steel or something, but it used to be very good. They literally nerfed it by half, or it's 50% as good as it used to be, but it's still okay. I find that it kind of bites you in the ass a lot of the time. Like a lot of times it actually draws a card that you didn't want because you can't actually play it now. That happens a lot more in the early to mid game when you're kind of starved for energy and you haven't really got a bunch of energy reduction on your spells, but or you don't have like permafrost and whatnot on them. In those cases it can be kind of annoying, but that can be kind of just up to you to play the game better or not. Like I think it's probably good if you're playing perfectly, but I'm often not playing perfectly, and when I don't do that, it kind of fucks me over. So I have mixed feelings about wing steel, but it's certainly a takeable artifact. And then these are all kind of grouped here. So these ones just add damage to your pyre. Probably the middle one's the best here. It doesn't actually add, it actually removes damage, but it dazes the enemy for a turn. That's usually a benefit. That's like saving yourself a ton of damage on average. There's a lot of enemies that basically just get one hit in and then die. In those cases, this relic makes it so they don't get any hits in. But yeah, there's not much to say there. Same with these. These just add deep. I guess this one, it just leeches your health off the kills. They're all really there just to, in a way, you could think of all of these basically just as relics that affect your pyre and its ability to mitigate its own damage. And then these are all merchant related. I mean, they're I usually won't skip them unless it's like obviously late, really late game. But I don't know. I think they're okay. I think that they're not like that insanely good, but they're just kind of okay. Like literally, as I've said, just okay. Often I feel you don't actually get to utilize the 3 slots on a lot of these. You really don't need 3 slots. That's just kind of nice to have. It's rare that the 3 slots was a difference maker in me like winning versus losing a run. I'd usually rather just want something that gives me like immediate benefit. And in the same sense, this relic doesn't really give you immediate benefit a lot of the time. It's just sort of a delayed benefit, and I'd rather just have the help immediately in most cases. But 25% reduction in merchant cost is certainly good. And then the magic power, it's okay. I mean, there's not like a whole lot of magic power going on with this combo. Really just the AoEs, all that would have much of an effect on. But it's in a way, it's like, it makes it so you might not have to upgrade something like Glimmer. with a plus 10 damage, so it's not something that's like worth straight up skipping, but it's certainly not one that I would take typically over a lot of the other stuff. Now, DPS unit upgrades, these are definitely worth thinking about. These two here are very commonly going to be always good. Multi-strike and then Burnout 1. The Burnout 1, you could have none of these extra stats and it would be as good as it is. Those are just icing on the cake. Really, it's just the fact that it's Burnout 1 that really makes this good. You know, it just allows your unit to die immediately, and if you have your reform, which you hopefully should, you know, once you find it, you can just get right into it. No need to really play a spell and kill your unit. They'll come right in and just, you know, my Animuses will almost always have this upgrade. And then the plus 10, it's probably not quite on the level of these, but it's still, you know, it's pretty much God tier. Especially with the Animus of Will, which is quite often, honestly, going to be your DPS come end game. Like, even if it's not the first DPS you end up adding, not that uncommon to see it and then just take him and then remove like your less than ideal DPS unit that you took initially. Multi-strike, everybody knows how good multi-strike is. It's pretty imperative to make a lot of the non-Animus of Will DPS units work, so you might have to forego some spell shops if you're basically to the point where it doesn't look like you're going to get offered any more banner units and you're stuck with the DPS unit that you have. You should probably hunt hard for multi-strike. You'll have to gauge it though. Then situationally, these can be good. I think Endless, so we're talking about DPS unit, but I'll just mention Endless can be pretty good on tomb units, just to help with either harvesting or killing tanks. But as far as DPS units go, Endless can be an option when you don't really have consistent reform. You know, particularly with like, if you're going the Harvest Rector route and things didn't really work out in terms of finding reform, this can be a totally fine upgrade to get. You could slap it on like a Wickless Baron, and now you have a hybrid tank and DPS unit that's going to reform up each floor for the bosses, and then maybe even you could, maybe you're running another DPS unit, you could even slap another Endless, or just find like the Endless Tome and slap it on your Harvest Rector. Any of those work. But it's situational, right? Like you don't want to open with this. This would be when you're getting toward the final circles and you never found your reform, then you might think about putting Endless on some of your banner units. Endless is always an okay one to put on your tombs though, just worth mentioning. Quick is pretty situational. Really, you're only looking at it with either Husk or the other sweeper, I forget, it's Shattered Shell or whatever. As I've said, if you're Harvest Rector and you have that, you know, your banner unit is one of those sweeper units, you'd really like to have Quick on them and probably like a plus 10 damage upgrade. That way you're just getting those initial sweepings guaranteed, and then you're guaranteed to get off to a good start. And a good start is kind of everything with Harvest. If you can't get them going fast enough, you're gonna fucking die. Like, you're gonna get just trampled by all these. You're just gonna have a mess of a situation on your hands. And then for each of these spell shops, so I'll mention this later too, but like generally I'm targeting spell shops more than I'm targeting the Merchants of Steels, because there's so many just good upgrades in the spell shop that can make or break your runs. So for holdover, that's generally the best upgrade you're going to be wanting to find. You won't always find it, and I will say if you don't find it, you should really focus on thinning your deck out and getting as much card draw as possible. If you have that, you can overcome not finding holdover, but holdover is always just the best case scenario, and by far these 4 cards are the best ones that you'll find it on. I usually would put it on Reform before anything else. So Molded is usually the prime target, but then after that, Crushing Demise or Subsiming Blade are amazing targets for it. You know, if you can stack Subsiming Blade every single turn, that thing will get up to 50 plus damage. And then Crushing Demise, just, you know, if you have Crushing Demise and Molded on holdover, if you have Molded and Subsiming Blade on holdover, you know, any combo of just 2 of these on holdover, God, you're gonna have a good game. You're gonna win. Like, it's just gonna happen. Like, it's so hard to lose if you have these combos on holdover. And then if you have extra holdover to spare, which is rare, but it does happen, these 3 are decent targets. Glimmer in particular, if you're Harvest. Being able to, you know, essentially that serves the purpose of like having a sweeper unit. And you don't have to take a sweeper unit in that case. If you have a Glimmer on holdover with like +10 damage, you're gonna kill every small unit every turn, and you're gonna get so many harvests on your Harvest Rector that's just gonna be beautiful. Same goes with Sharpen and Razor Sharp Edge, similar things. You know, Sharpen, you can you know, take it down by an energy, put it on holdover, and you can rotate who you put it on. You can put some spikes on the front. Once you have enough spikes to kill the small units, you can switch to like your multi-strike DPS unit and just add damage to them. And in that sense, nothing beats Razor Sharp Edge, though, in just sheer terms of being able to, you know, add damage. Now, permafrost targets, I should mention just in general, permafrost is one of those upgrades that's almost never bad to put on something. It's just, it's less ideal than holdover in a lot of cases. You know, particularly we're looking at Crushing Demise, Molded, and Wicked Blaze, which were prime, you know, god tier targets for holdover. I would, if it was early on, I wouldn't just willy-nilly slap permafrost on these cards. I would try to hold out for holdover. I'm only really putting permafrost on these cards in particular if it's late game and I couldn't find holdover. If that's the case, permafrost is pretty fine. I mean, it's you know, it's going to guarantee that you can at least reform on the boss levels. You just probably won't be reforming quite as much. That's really all that comes down to. But then you have a lot of additional cards that also are pretty good with permafrost. It's rare to find a card that wouldn't be good with permafrost, but these are some that stand out to me. Like Wickless Recruitment. You know, I always keep coming back to Harvest Rector, but usually if you took Harvest Rector, it means you didn't have any Burnout Extension or Reform in your opening deck, and it's completely, you know, not out of the question that you might not find a good consistent form of Reform. Like, you might find Reform, but it's so late that you couldn't put holdover and stuff on it, right? Well, in cases like that, you could get by with reforming them once you hit the boss. And if you have Wickless Recruitment on permafrost, then the fact that, you know, your Harvest Rector, who has tons of good stats, you know, he comes back with only 1 burnout because he couldn't die or anything before. But if you got Wickless Recruitment on permafrost in that situation, well, now you can remove that burnout after you reform him, and boom, you got you're pretty much going to win at that point. You got a huge stat unit that already fought the boss once and probably isn't going to have a problem now. And it's kind of the same thing with Hallowed Drippings. It kind of has the same purpose on permafrost that Wickless Recruitment does. Like, even better if you can, you know, double stack it. It won't give you quite the longevity that Wickless Recruitment does, but it might have a little more flexibility in what it can do. Like, you can consume it. You can apply it to everything. So like, if you just want to apply a bunch of burnout and you need it at the moment, you can do that. But you know, permafrost is fine. It's basically like a poor man's Wickless Recruitment at that point. Dripfall, mainly for the bosses, I feel, especially if you know, you could double stack it and permafrost it. That's a lot of resources to put into it, but that's still dazed too, with the added benefit that, you know, I guess if I permafrost it, it's not necessarily for the enemy either. Like, if I permafrost it, particularly with Harvest Rector, there's cases where I have to take a few banner units, like another okay banner unit. I don't think I outline it in here, but Big Sludge, He's an interesting unit because he's actually very good, but not really for the strategy. All that being said, if you need it, it's something that you know, you can take, and in a lot of those cases you can never fit everything on one floor. But if you have him stacking his rage all fight, and then maybe two other, you know, maybe a Wickless Baron and a Harvest Rector on the bottom floor, you could permafrost this and then drip file him down to make a super floor before the boss fight. That's always an option. It's a flexible card when on permafrost, let's put it that way. Generally used to fight the boss, I would say. Steel Pulleyclaw, as I said, it's a get out of jail free card, but permafrost just makes it so you don't have to rely on turning, you know, drawing at the particular turn to be able to use it. If it's on permafrost, it can get one of those gilded wings out of your hair exactly at the point you need it. And then adaptive mutation, it's pretty situational, but like, you know, you could have something like any of the thorn, you know, the hollow units, you could make them into a DPS unit and stick something in front of them. You're pretty flexible to be able to move units around and stick them here and there, typically with Melting Remnant. So it's not that out of the question. You could even do it with your Harvest Rector. Like Harvest Rector can gain so much health, right? But if you could, you know, if he's on the middle floor, you could drip fall him down, so now he's behind like a Wickless Baron or something, and then adaptively mutate him to just do a ton of damage. That's always an option too. Double stack targets. We've talked about a lot of these double stack targets, so I won't really get into Sharp, Hallowed, or Steel Pulleyclaw is an interesting one. It basically, if it has Dazed 6, there's nothing that's really going to survive that. It's pretty powerful on double stack. But yeah, we've talked about that. Engulfed in Smoke. I typically don't like Engulfed in Smoke for my strategies. Like I said, you're not really worried about your own units dying that much. The only time you are is really just Harvest Rector, and just Harvest Rector himself, you don't want to die a lot of the time. But a lot of the time, he has spikes, so it's like you want him to get hit. Or you have 2 minutes, so you want him to get hit. So I really don't find stealth typically that good. But that being said, in the rare cases where it makes sense for your deck, double stacking it is pretty powerful. I mean, against a boss, a whole 4 extra turns of not getting hit, yeah, that's pretty good. Mortal Entrapment, we've talked about this. It's usable when the daze is at 4. At 2, it's pretty hard to justify this. Spreading Spores is pretty niche as well, but I sometimes will make this work against the spell consumption version of Seraph. If you double stack it, spikes 4, particularly for Harvest Rector, it's not too bad. Like, you can really stack up some regen and some spikes on him, and you can survive without really having to reform him on a floor. Ensnare is maybe similar to Entrapment and Dripfall. It just sort of makes it so you have a whole additional turn to just wait on maybe some tank to kill it or something, so it's not a horrible double stack target. And then now we get to my most hated fucking upgrade, which is Eternal Stone. I'm always so sad to see this at a spell shop because it could have been something actually useful. And even, I will say, out of these 3, most of the time I'm not purchasing it on these 3. I put some hearts around this one, Petrified Skull, because it's really the only one I'm ever actually happy to like actually hunt. It's the only time I'll actually hunt for Eternal Stone is when I have Petrified Skull. And obviously when the relic has come in that allows it to be a consume instead of a purge. But you know, quick note on these. Really, for Invigorating Solution in particular, I would only make this Eternal with Harvest Rector probably, and only if I took double space upgrade, because then it gives me a reusable way to draw cards. I would do the same with Preserve Thorns in that case, but I would also give an additional that maybe if I was really thin on spells and I was fighting spell consumption Seraph, I would be down to make this Eternal and maybe not consume it, maybe once or twice, just to get a bunch of stings into my deck. Sacred Wicks, the reason I would make that eternal is if it was the unfortunate situation where I was relying on Sacred Wicks as my main reform. I've done it before. It's tough to do, but it's doable. But you do definitely need Eternal Stone on it for that to work, because you still need to be reforming your shit quite often, right? So that's really Eternal Stone. It's not that useful in an upgrade. And then I figured it was worth mentioning out here. Now, obviously, there's always some random niche situation that any of these could maybe be good in, right? But I'm not here to really talk about that. I'm here to say, what is the consistent strategy that I've been able to use, and you know, to be able to get around 50% win rate on Covenant 25 and to 6 streak. One thing I've really done is I've never picked any of these cards, not really even once. I could go through them real quick. Like Pyrogro, it got a change in the last patch. Technically, the card itself is better, but it really just doesn't do anything for our game plan. Remember, we want card draw, we don't want energy, and this does the exact opposite of what we need. Like I don't want to. It's basically a net -3 to your card draw, because you have to draw the card itself too, right? Just to get energy for the rest of the battle. That's really not doing anything good for us. Sting is like, it's interesting because like we have a lot of cards in here like Preserve Thorns and Vine Mother, that artifact, you know, things that add stings that we love, but actually just adding the card Sting to our deck, rarely would I ever do that. It's not really doing much other than slightly, like, technically it doesn't cost a draw, but it does delay your draw. That alone just makes me not want to put it in the deck, because it doesn't do doesn't do enough otherwise for me to justify putting it in the deck. Maybe if I, for some reason, already had the Sting like artifacts, maybe I would consider it, but really just almost never taking Sting. Unleashed Wildwood, we've kind of talked about heal and how we don't need it. Well, this, all it does is heal, so just never really need it. Channel Song, you know, people have a lot of mixed feelings on this one. In my opinion, it's probably hitting on a drag most of the time. And that's just, to me, that's not a difference maker. Like, on paper, 2020 seems pretty good, but like, I would never... I just don't want to add this card to my deck. True, if it hits on a drag, it was almost like just drawing the drag. Granted, I had to spend the extra energy, but even then, I would rather have, instead of the Channel Song, I just would have rather drawn like an actual card that supports my game plan a lot more directly. And as far as it hitting on an actual banner unit, that's just not going to happen here. Yeah, so Channel Song, just I would never take it. Edge Prior, healing, even, I've never thought this was a good card in general, but it's just not going to work here. Awake, it's really just healing and regen. A lot of energy, just no reason to ever add it. Memories of the Melted, no idea why this card exists. I guess one positive I could say for it is that it consumes itself for 0 energy, so that's nice. Like, it's... But I get so irate whenever I see this card, because I'm like, I just don't understand like why it exists. Obviously, it doesn't exist for the Melting Remnant, because there's no good non-consumable X-cost cards that really benefit that much from having a ton of energy, and there's no like high energy cost things. So I guess the only reason it exists is for secondary classes or whatever, so like Shadow Siege and whatnot. But even then, it's so inconsistent, because you have to draw it the same turn, or at least permafrost it, you know, and then draw into your Shadow Siege later. Since it's a banner unit, you're obviously not going to have units dead on the first turn. I don't know, I could rant on, but just don't take it. It's absolutely useless. Resin Removal, in the same vein, just almost always useless. There's really just not that many debuffs and not that many buffs. Not many debuffs on you, and not that many buffs on the enemy. I would much rather this get combined and like not only debuff them but silence them as well. That might be a little more useful. Even then it's not a great card, but it's at least maybe useful. As it stands though, I can't see any reason you'd ever want to add this to your deck. In Graft, similar, it's more of an Awoken primary type card. Like, it'll give you some like a rejuve proc on your champ if you took that, but for Melting and Graft just makes no sense. And Shard Channeler as well, it's like, I just don't see too many cases where I justify taking up space to get this effect. Like, I do like extra damage on spikes, but you're pretty starved for space, and I can't justify Shard Channeler really doing that. If you have spikes already, you're probably good on AoE, and you're just wanting to kill tanks at that point. You're probably good on bosses too. Really, you just need to kill tanks, and Shard Channeler is not going to help with that. Wildwood Sap, as good as this card is on its own, it just doesn't, you know, as we've said, regen is just not what you need at all in this strategy. Restoring Retreat, I don't know, in theory I could make this work, but in practice I never really have found much use for it. You know, it should be essentially doing what Dripfall does without doing the stun, but with costing an extra energy. But I don't know, if there was one card I might say could maybe work, it would be Restoring Retreat. I just haven't witnessed it really do it. The energy cost is too high. I don't even want to spend an energy upgrade on it. And rarely am I just stacking floors, so I don't know. It doesn't find me much use. And Wilting Sapwood, one of the shittier cards in the game, but especially, it costs 2 energy, it takes up 3 space, it doesn't even do anything. Like, no reason ever to add that to your deck in this strategy. Intent on Death, I stand by this one. I just don't see myself wanting to add this to a deck. Yes, theoretically there's some world where you could put Holdover on it, and then you have like a Tomb unit that you can just play over and over again, but that's not a world that I find ever consistently happening. That's so niche that I would say just don't really add this to your deck. It's so useless most of the time. Like, I don't know. I don't ever find this to be a very good card. And Devourer of Death, I don't know what the design goal is on this card, but it makes no sense. The card is completely at odds with itself. If you're killing enough units for it to gain souls, that means you're already doing AoE damage. But what it does is after it dies, it then deals AoE damage. And not even that insane amount of it. Like I don't know, I don't see any strength that this card has. It's also weird to like have it die, because you'd have to stick it in the, I guess like you would stick it in the back, and then just when you fight the boss, I guess it just does a bunch of damage, but I don't know, it really doesn't do that much damage. I guess it could be a boss finisher, but bosses aren't your issue with this strategy. This is just, if it's really meant for killing a boss, then it falls right into the win more category. In Wickless Tycoon, this card kind of just wishes it was Paraffin, whatever, Paraffin Thug or whatever. The stats just suck on it, and the harvest, like, it doesn't really get you that enough gold to justify adding a shitty banner unit. You know, Paraffin Thug is not a shitty banner unit. If it didn't have any gold gain, it would still be a pretty good option for DPS. It's got low health, high damage. This unit has high health, low damage. And it doesn't even, I would argue it doesn't even get you as much gold as Paraffin Thug does, especially if the Paraffin Thug has multi-strike. So Wickless Tycoon, you're going to have to remove it at some point, because you definitely don't want it in your final fight for Seraph. I just don't really ever see Wickless Tycoon being needed. If you can justify adding him to your deck, that means your deck is already strong, and this just becomes win more at that point. So yeah, I don't really like Wickless Tycoon. If they want to make that unit useful, they have to make his stats good. And I know they buffed it, trust me, they didn't buff it enough. So a little quick note on card removal priority, because I think a lot of people always are interested in this. Stewards first, pretty much always. Only exception, I guess, would be like advanced prototype. Even then, I think I would lean toward removing them first. Maybe on the very first removal, you could do a restore instead. But in general, it's going to be trained stewards first. Kind of no questions asked. You just don't want to justify. Like, they take up 2 floor space, their stats suck, they don't reform in any good way, there's just not any, you want to get them out ASAP. And then after that, it's probably going to be restores. The thing about restore, you don't have to remove all of them, because that upgrade where you add 20 magic damage and consume it's only 20 or 25 gold or whatever, and that's a perfectly fine way to basically make these things remove themselves. Comparing to Steward, they cost the same amount of energy to do that, but the restore difference is you don't have to like place it down on the board and then have it be a liability in that way. And also, you also don't want these in your pool of reform cards, because sometimes you just want to reform empty stuff early on so you're not adding shit back in. And then I put a little note here. Any banner units that are no longer needed. The reason I'm putting this in the second priority over the first is the point at which you would actually do this, you should have all your stewards gone anyway. Really, this is like either the second to last or last circle is when you start considering this. So to give an example, let's say I beat my first circle and I'm offered a unit draft, and the best option is Paraffin Thug. So I take Paraffin Thug. He carries me through the early mid game, gets me a lot of gold, does some good stuff, but then I see a Animus of Will as like my final banner unit added, offered. Well, in that case, I'll take the Animus of Will, but I still, I can live with having the both of them in my deck for a pretty good while, and it's almost like a benefit to do that, so I should still just remove stewards at that point. But then, along the way, I end up getting my upgrades that I need on my Animus of Will. I get a plus 10 damage upgrade, I get the plus burnout upgrade, I have my reform cards, I have my train going, At that point, I want to guarantee Animus of Will as my DPS unit drawed. So at that point, it's time to just remove the Paraffin Thug. And you can apply that to any other banner unit, right, that you might have had to take to get you through the early game. And then third, dregs. I usually don't remove dregs until about the final floor, because I'm usually it's enough work to try to get rid of these things. The nice thing about dregs is they're really good early game, they're really good mid game. They do fall off a bit by late game, but it's still a 0 energy thing that essentially consumes itself. It provides harvest stacks, it can tank a little bit of damage, deal a little bit of damage. They're not that much of a liability to keep in your deck, but that being said, if you have removes to spare, often if you've kind of dealt with all these things, removing a few dregs might make sense. And then I kind of added another note here that says anything that serves no purpose and does not consume itself when played. So like going back to this useless card section, like you'll often get some of these cards just in your starter deck. It's rare that I have to remove one of these, right? Like as much as I hate Memories of the Melted, it consumes itself, so I don't really need to reach that hard to remove it. Whereas if I started with, say, resin removal, I might just want to remove resin removal because it doesn't do spell damage, so I can't add the self-consumption to it. But it's generally useless enough that I would just say, I would even say it's better removing it than a drag. I would rather have a drag in my deck than that useless spell. So that's kind of what the logic that goes in there. And then just some final kind of miscellaneous notes here. This is the kind of the order of priority of the shops. You have the magic shop, the Merchant of Steel, and the Merchant of Trinkets. Merchant of Trinkets, I pretty much never prioritize visiting this. The only reason I would visit a Merchant of Trinkets is if there were other things on that route that were enticing me more. But Merchant of Trinkets is almost, you know, artifacts really are not the main thing that make this strategy work. They're just sort of icing on the cake in a lot of cases. And to be honest, most artifacts are kind of duds. They kind of don't do much for you. There's only a few that really do that much for you. And in that same sense, as far as trials go, if it's a random artifact that's offered, I would say don't reach for it. Only take that trial if you really think you can handle it easily. If it seems like it's questionable, it's not worth it for a random artifact. And then, so Merchant of Steel, mainly you're just hunting for that burnout upgrade and the multi-strike. Unless you have Animus of Will. If the Animus of Will, really all you need is that burnout upgrade. But with all the other DPS units, you'd want that multi-strike. But that's really it there. Mainly it's the Merchant of Magic that most of the time you want to be visiting. You know, you're always guaranteed an energy reduction. Half of every reroll you're going to get plus 10 damage or the plus 20 damage in consumption. Both of those are great. They're cheap. The plus 10 damage, you'd like to see that on like a Glimmer or a Vine Grasp. The consumption is just sort of a cheap way to kind of pseudo remove your cards. It's obviously not as good as just straight up purging it, but you don't have the luxury to purge all your unwanted cards. A lot of the time, the best way to deal with thinning that out is just to have that consumption effect added. And then of course holdover, you're always hunting for holdover, always. And then situationally you're hunting for permafrost, and then to a lesser degree double stack, and to a very lesser degree Eternal Stone. You're hunting to not get Eternal Stone most of the time. Yeah, because fuck that upgrade. But then also on a similar note, Hellvent. Early on Hellvents are maybe less enticing than later on ones, but Hellvent is just always really good. There's usually some key card that you have. The best scenario is if it already has like the holdover or the permafrost or whatever on it. You know, and that like if you have a molded and you got an early holdover on it and you can Hellvent that, you basically just set yourself up to win the game. You just need to add a few pieces here and there. The thing is, you don't need every piece for this to win. I've like looked through my runs. I often don't have everything, and I still win, and I win in a stomping fashion, right? This is just like the ideal game plans I'm laying out here. But Hellvent's pretty important, you know, and think about what you need the most, especially as the game gets later. If you're already good on Reform, don't travel into the win more territory of duplicating yet another Reform card. Like you might want to look into like Crushing Demise or Subsounding Blade. You know, think of the things that you're lacking and then try to Hellvent to fix that. In the same regard, removal is always good. You want a thin deck. You want high draw and you want thinness because it's the key cards that make this thing work. You know, and especially if you didn't get holdover, a thin deck with high draw is going to almost accomplish the same thing a holdover would. I've made a lot of things work without holdover. And as I've said with the artifacts, I don't really like, obviously I'll take an artifact if it's convenient on that route, but I never let an artifact be that much of a positive reason for me to go into any particular route. There's just so many duds that it's hard for me to I should do an analysis at some point, but if I were to just spitball, I'd say well over half the time it's an artifact I don't need when I see this. Yeah. And then quick notes up here. I thought it was worth reiterating just what you want to see and what you want to upgrade with each of these. So like the Burnout Flicker, I probably should have put on my top because really I should signify he's the one you really want. Like if you see any of these type of cards in your opener, pick them. And even, you know, early game, whatnot, I could still, like if it seemed like I was hurting for Burnout Extension, I would add even one more. Just know that Burnout Extension is not going to be the strategy that wins you against Seraph. By the time you meet Seraph, you really want at least one molded. And then you can, if you have one, you can Hellvent it, and then you'll be sitting pretty good. But yeah, the earlier you can find molded, the better. And I can only say so much about this without just showing you. Like, you should really, if you are interested in this, check out my videos, the ones leading up to this in particular, and you'll kind of see the process there. It's pretty solid. It's a pretty solid process. Now for Harvest is a little more tricky, requires a little more improvisation, but in general, if you can find good AoE, if you can find good tomb units, it's going to go a long way to helping you out. And also, the upgrade, when you go Burnout Rector, there's no question about it, you should always go double draw upgrade. That's just always going to be the best option no matter what. No questions asked. Harvest is a little bit different. And I said this here not to say that 1-in-1 is the best combo, just to say that you're often going to take one or the other. It's not uncommon for me to take 2 space upgrades with Harvest. That's just, unfortunately, the necessary path you have to take sometimes. One thing you got to remember, though, is for every draw upgrade you don't take, you got to try to keep your deck that much more thin, or you got to add that much more extra card draw to your deck. Yeah, that's pretty much it there. Because if you go double space upgrade, it's very hard to get to your key pieces, but it's not impossible. It's just you're a little bit handicapped there. And then just in, hopefully this is readable here, but I just made a few notes saying thin deck is always good, and a very thin deck will overcome the lack of holdover. And on that same note, you don't want to add fluff. Fluff meaning you could. I don't even necessarily mean win more necessarily. Just simply, you know, I listed Glimmer as like a good AOE, right? But if you don't need AOE, then don't add Glimmer. Just skip it. If you don't need spikes, skip it. If you don't need you know, some Burnout Extension, like you already got your molded or whatnot, don't take anymore. If you already got even your high quality cards like molded, you know, say you got 3 of them, one of them's on holdover, you probably don't need another molded. Although it wouldn't, in that case, it probably wouldn't be horrible to take it, but you can kind of get the concept there. Just don't add things you don't need. It just makes it that much harder to draw on the stuff that you actually need. And on that, I guess on a third note there, 25 or under for deck size is kind of a general end game deck size I typically see. That can obviously vary, but I definitely want it under 30 for sure. If it's 30 or above, I'm going to be struggling, even with a lot of draw. Now there's a little bit that goes in there too. If I have sacrificial consumption, if I have a lot of card draw, I can maybe get away with a little bit more of a deck size, but it certainly can't hurt to keep it small. Purging is a great thing, especially by late game, to really focus on. Oh yeah, and you know, if you do end up having to go Harvest Rector, I will usually, if I see Endless Tome, I'll take it. Even if I don't end up using it, like if I find Reform later on, I'll lean into that. But it's not like bad to take Endless Tome because it gives you that option. And even with Reform, sometimes I still want the Endless Tome on my Harvest. Like if I'm just simply reforming my DPS unit and I have some sort of targeted way to kill them, like a Subsiding Blade instead of a Crushing Demise, that still works. Yeah, and even the endless upgrade at the merchants, that can work for your DPS unit if you never found Reform. You know, you can take that final Merchant of Steel and just, you know, you got a 50% chance if you reroll twice to try to get endless. And you know, Animus Will, I've had cases where I couldn't Reform her because I didn't get any Reform cards, but You know, on Endless, I could just keep putting a razor sharp edge on her, and I was able to make it work because I still got a lot of damage on her, and she was able to reform up each, you know, because of Endless, she was able to play against each floor of the boss. So it's definitely something that can work. And I've kind of mentioned this before, but Burnout Rector really should only have one banner unit by the end of the game, and that should be your DPS unit that's kind of sitting behind him. And you really should leave space on your floors as you approach the boss, because you know, you don't want a steward taking up a spot that could have been your DPS unit or your Rector. You don't want a drag that has too much burnout still that is taking up a space now that you can't play one of your Rector or your DPS. That's kind of game losing in a lot of situations, and that's a mistake you might make the first few times you do this. I know I did, but once you develop kind of the knowledge to do that, you're gonna mess up less and less. And as long as you keep that, you know, scold yourself when you do it and try to learn from it, you'll eventually start to really remember to take into account like when the boss is coming, and to make sure that you don't have units sort of blocking your way of reform. And also the Harvest Rector, I've kind of said how it's you have to improv a lot with it. You're not always going to be able to just limit yourself to one DPS banner unit with Harvest Rector. You can, a lot of the times, that is still the ideal situation. However, it's pretty not that uncommon to either have 2 DPS units or to have a DPS unit and some other hybrid unit, like a sludge, whatever it is, the big sludge dude. He costs 2 energy, takes 3 space, gains a bunch of rage when he kills a unit. You know, it's not uncommon to have some sort of combo of having a unit like that along with another DPS unit, because you just don't have as much damage with the Harvest Rector. And if you look at the base damage here, it's 145 versus 30. That's pretty big, right? Just some things you have to think about. You don't get as much luxury with the Harvest version. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully that was useful. You should check out my videos if you are interested in really seeing this in action. Like I said, it got me to 6 streaking with on Covenant 25, and I could have got 7, honestly. I made the mistake of going Resolve route on my 7th game, and it was a game I still made it to Seraph. I just couldn't beat it. But if I had gone Burnout, I would have won for sure. So I'm going for 7 next. Keep, you know, subscribe if you thought this was useful. I'll be going for 7 next. We'll see if we get it. Hopefully this was useful. Thank you, and see you next time.